The judge tells him, "You are going to be in jail until you die." And Maurice responds to the judge with, "I can't wait."
Only one thing is certain. No amount of prison time can bring closure to those who loved Olamide.
She was a beautiful young woman with a bright future. Taken senselessly by someone who couldn't control his own behavior.
She was just months away from graduation, from moving forward to her dreams of becoming a doctor, but she came across the wrong person.
Teenage love is in full bloom in Yale, Michigan, but not everyone's happy for Tia Skinner and her new boyfriend.
He was a bad guy with a bad reputation. Tia's parents forbid her from seeing him.
But she's willing to take drastic measures to keep her new man in her life.
What she orchestrated was just horrific. I don't know how anyone could come up with something like this. She saw her parents as an obstacle, and she wasn't going to let them get in the way of her and her boyfriend.
And later, in a suburb of Detroit, love-starved Renyatta Hamilton falls hard for a self-described bad boy.
She was in love with a hardened criminal. No good could come of this.
And when Renyatta is pulled into his life of crime, it costs her more than she could ever imagine.
She did this to prove her loyalty to him in hopes that he would never leave her.
And it was her wanting to please her man.
In the small town of Yale, Michigan, Tia Skinner has finally found a home after being bounced from house to house.
By the age of 3, Tia was taken in by her aunt, Uncle Merritt, and Paul Skinner.
This is for you.
She had 3 older siblings, 2 brothers, and 1 sister who were about 5 to 6 years older than her. Tia's older brother, Jeffrey, was her half-brother. They shared the same mother. And Paul and Mara adopted him a few years before Tia was born. Her other 2 older siblings, Aaron and Madeline, they were Paul and Mara's children.
What color nightlight would you like?
Being adopted by family, what's called the kinship home, certainly gives a child a much better advantage with regard to fitting into a family. For Tia, this was advantageous for her because it helped her have a quicker adjustment, and it helped her as far as being a more successful adult.
And her new beginning with the Skinner family is a testament to how far she's come.
Tia was born in a state penitentiary. Her mother was a drug addict. After Tia was born, she was taken by her biological father, who had her for a short amount of time.
She did have a good relationship with her biological father, up until she was about 8 years old when he passed away.
Over the next 14 years, the family showers Tia with love, giving her everything she needs and more.
The Skinners were a very active family. They went on ski trips, camping trips. They loved to hang out together and have fun together and travel together. They were just a fun, loving family.
With their support, Tia thrives.
She was an honor student. She was well-liked. She was very involved. She played basketball. She was in the band. She played volleyball. And her family, they were her biggest cheerleaders.
By her senior year of high school, all of her siblings are away at college, and 17-year-old Tia is left alone with her parents.
Paul had a job as a pipe fitter, and he was out of state quite a bit. He was home on weekends. Mara was in the school system as a teacher.
With Paul gone most days, she's under Mara's wing 24/7.
Tia and Mara had a pretty regular schedule. Tia would make coffee for Mara in the morning. They'd ride to school together. After school, she would be dropped off to babysit, unless she had after-school activities. So they had a pretty steady and regular routine.
As perfect as things may seem, there's still one crack in the family picture as Tia begins to blossom into a young woman.
You're supposed to be doing your homework.
The Skinner family, they never really had any major points of contention with Tia, but they did have issues with the boys that she chose to date, and it really started to become a problem for the family.
I was just asking my friend Ashley for help.
Okay, just
Stay focused.
Her parents felt that the guys that she was choosing weren't worthy of dating her. They were dropping out of school, they were hanging out with the wrong crowd, they were into drugs, and so that became a very big struggle for her parents.
Tia appears to have gone for the bad boys because that's what she knew. No matter how bad her dad was, she loved him for that, and so overlooked a lot of his very bad habits. She did the same thing with the bad boys.
But their faith in God always keeps the family centered, even through her trying teenage years.
The Skinners were a church-going family. Tia was involved in a youth group, and they went to church regularly.
Every Wednesday night, she attends Bible study. And on one fall evening, she runs into 18-year-old Jonathan Kurtz, an old crush that will change her life forever.
Tia actually knew Jonathan from high school. He was a year older than her, and he dropped out of high school and moved away for a while. And they reconnected when he came back, and she met up again at her church youth group.
Those few hours together bring back old feelings. And the next day, Jonathan asks Tia to be his girlfriend. She happily accepts, but when she tells her mother, Mara isn't nearly as excited.
And I think he really likes me, and I really like him too. Who is it? Jonathan Kurtz?
Tia's mother knew most of the kids in the neighborhood, but she wasn't quite sure she was familiar with Jonathan.
The name rings a bell, but I hope it's not the guy I'm thinking of.
And what Mara recalls from teaching him in middle school convinces her she doesn't want Jonathan around her daughter.
He was known for being involved with drugs, and at some point he was hospitalized for mental issues.
Tia assures her that Jonathan has changed, and she begs her mom to give him a chance.
You don't trust me with anything! I never trust me! No, that's not true.
But Mara's mind is already made up.
She wanted Tia to stop seeing him, and so she immediately objected to any continuation of the relationship.
When Tia's father comes home from work that weekend, he sides with Mara. But Jonathan's rebel ways are already rubbing off. Despite her parents' orders, she keeps seeing him anyway.
Their relationship pretty much had to be kept in secret. They had to sneak and text each other. They would meet at youth group, but there wasn't a lot of time that they had to actually spend together one-on-one.
What we typically see in young love is, in this particular case, a young woman meets a guy who makes her feel really special, and therefore, because he is the first one, he's setting the template. She goes for him hook, line, and sinker.
But her backdoor defiance is quickly found out.
Mara drove past the park, and she happened to see Tia with Jonathan. They were just sitting there talking, but she was surprised. She didn't expect to see them together.
Embarrassed, Tia leaves Jonathan behind and jumps in the car with a disappointed Mara. And what Mara has to say goes in one ear and out the other.
Jonathan sent Tia a text message that said he loved her, and Tia responded and said she loved him too. She decided to take her cell phone away and put her on punishment and said that she was no longer allowed to date Jonathan.
Mara thinks she's made her point. What she doesn't know is that she's incited a burning rage inside Tia.
Tia was young and impressionable, and Jonathan came along and offered her something that she felt that she didn't have at home. The excitement, taking a walk on the wild side. And so she was completely open to that experience, even though it turned out to be a very negative one.
2 weeks into her relationship with Jonathan, Tia proposes a wicked plan.
Tia and Jonathan were texting, and she mentioned that she wished they were dead.
Tia was so consumed with this relationship and appeared to be so immature that she didn't realize the power of her words.
Jonathan offered to kill her parents. Tia didn't think twice. She thought it would be better for both of them if her parents were dead. She saw this as a chance to be free. Her and Jonathan could be together all they wanted.
To sweeten the pot for her new boyfriend, the 17-year-old decides to turn some funds she received from a recent academic scholarship from book money to blood money.
She offered Jonathan $1,000 to kill her parents.
Now that the plan is in play, Tia and Jonathan start the countdown to their independence.
for Tia just to be detached from her parents in that way, having no feelings for them, not even seeing them as human beings, was so quick, was so rapid. But at the end of that tunnel for her was her freedom, the freedom to be with Jonathan.
Nothing was going to stand in the way of their love, not even family.
My wedding is coming up, and I want to feel fabulous. The new Weight Watchers app gave me a healthy, personalized plan that worked for me. I look in the mirror, and I'm proud of that girl.
Your glasses can change the way you see the world. They can be bold, polished, complex, or unexpected. Find your perfect pair at Warby Parker. Or maybe your perspective is artful, simple, sharp, and classic. Find your perfect pair at Warby Parker, starting at $95, including prescription lenses.
In the small town of Yale, Michigan, 17-year-old Tia Skinner has fallen in love with 18-year-old bad boy Jonathan Kurtz. Her parents have forbidden her from seeing him, but no one's going to keep Tia from her new man.
Jonathan Kurtz was not a stable man. He'd been in and out of mental facilities and had a history with drugs.
Tia and Jonathan had been together about 2 weeks, but she was convinced he was worth fighting for.
The passion in Tia's relationship with Jonathan was very deep. She was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice in order for the two of them to be together for what she thought would be forever.
And when she suggests that they kill her parents, Jonathan jumps at the chance to prove himself to her. But he realizes he needs a little help.
Jonathan wanted to recruit his neighbor, James Preston, who had gone to high school with both he and Tia.
Jonathan approached James and said he was going to get $1,000 and that he'd split it with him.
And 18-year-old James Preston jumps on board.
James might have gotten involved for financial opportunity. After all, he was going to get half of the murder fee and had a child to take care of and needed the money.
Now that the killers are hired, Tia wants the job done as soon as possible, so she and Jonathan can be together forever.
Tia explained exactly how this was going to work. She drew a map of her house, how they would get in through her window so that they knew exactly how to get from her room to the parents' bedroom. It was going to look like a break-in, and Tia was going to be downstairs in the basement watching a movie so that it would seem as if she didn't know or didn't hear what was going on.
This plan that Tia came up with was so well thought out, so complex. It really makes you wonder whether she had thought of this plan before, whether she had been working on this, perhaps because her parents kept her from being with someone else in the past.
And 10 days into her relationship with Jonathan, the date for the murder is set.
Tia told James and Jonathan that next Friday, when her father returned from his out-of-town job, that is when she wanted the killing done.
The following Thursday, a day before the planned murders, Tia plays the role of dutiful daughter.
She still fixed Mara's coffee. They rode to school together. They followed their regular routine. It was just a normal day.
But that Thursday afternoon, a day before they plan to carry out the murders, an unexpected arrival throws a wrench in their plans.
When Tia got home from school that day, she found out that her dad came home early. She sent a quick text to Jonathan telling him that they should do the murder tonight, and it should be done at 11 o'clock.
This will be the end to Tia's troubles, and she and Jonathan can be free to pursue their love without interference. She has officially put the nail in her parents' coffin.
No, we're not doing this tomorrow. We're doing this tonight.
Jonathan and James will be ready. And while her murder squad watches the seconds tick off the clock, Tia spends some final hours with Paul and Mara.
She and her parents had a normal evening. They went shopping together, they went out to dinner, and they came back home.
But when they return home from dinner, Tia's thrown off when greeted by her brother Jeffrey, who's making an unexpected visit. But she knows it's too late to call off the boys.
He and his parents were in the kitchen talking, and Tia took this opportunity to sneak upstairs.
When Tia stepped into that house and saw Jeffrey, this was a sign that this plan wasn't going to go smooth as she wanted it to. In many ways, it brought her back to her own reality, to the possible guilt that she would be having to deal with, that she murdered her parents, but also murdered the parents of her siblings too.
But the plan is still on. She anxiously awaits the arrival of Jonathan and James.
At around 11 o'clock, Tia's parents had gone to bed. Jeffrey was in the living room, and Tia was at her bedroom window waiting on the boys.
At 11:05, Jonathan and James jump the fence and run over to Tia's bedroom window where she lets them in.
They had bandanas to cover their faces. They had stolen James' father's hunting knives. They came prepared.
Tia has a chance to save her family, but she only chooses to spare her brother Jeffrey's life.
You gotta get rid of him too, or we're gonna have to kill him.
Just give me 5 minutes before you go to my parents'.
She told them that her brother Jeffrey was downstairs, and Jonathan made it very clear to her that if he wasn't in the basement, he was going to kill her brother.
So she decides to lure him into the basement by telling her brother that she wants to watch a movie.
It's quite possible that Tia spared Jeffrey's life because, after all, that was her sibling. But also in her mind, he had never crossed her.
By 11:30 p.m., everyone is in place. Tia is in the basement with brother Jeffrey. Jonathan and James are upstairs, creeping up on Paul and Mara.
They went into the bedroom where Mara and Paul were sleeping and started stabbing them.
She heard their blood-curdling cries and was completely unmoved by it.
And later, in the Detroit suburbs, Renyatta Hamilton's first shot at love may be her last taste of freedom.
She had no regard for that man's life. She fed him straight to the devil.
All my love scattered everywhere.
When he looked at me, I just melted.
Dreams so sweet turned into a nightmare.
I didn't suspect that he was a straight-out killer demon. I knew I was in trouble. That's a hell of a price to pay. Just for one damn man.
While Tia's motive to kill her parents is to be with Jonathan, he has his own reasons.
Jonathan didn't really have a lot to lose in the situation. He had already dropped out of school. He didn't really have a lot going for himself. He had this street persona that he was trying to show everyone.
"17-year-old Tia Skinner and her 18-year-old boyfriend Jonathan Kurtz have decided to murder her parents. While the Skinners sleep, Jonathan and his neighbor James Preston execute the horrifying plan.
Jonathan and James walked into that pitch black room, and Jonathan began to stab Mara, and James began to stab Paul.
Despite the surprise attack, Paul manages to fight back.
Paul eventually got James into a chokehold, but he didn't have enough strength to hold him. So he got up and tried to chase them.
Tia heard blood-curdling cries from her parents. They were both yelling for help.
Jeffrey bolts up the basement stairs, and when he reaches the top, he follows a trail of blood to the front door and watches as his father stumbles back inside.
His father really didn't think he was going to make it, so he demanded that he go upstairs and try and save his mother instead.
In the master bedroom, Mara's been stabbed 26 times, but she's able to grab her phone and call 911.
Mom, just hang in there, it's okay. I'm gonna check on them.
Jeffrey's torn between which parent to help. Assessing that Mara's in better shape, he runs back downstairs in a last-ditch effort to save his father.
Jeffrey called for Tia's help, but she never came upstairs to help. Tia was downstairs as cool as a cucumber.
It appears that Tia was so emotionally distant, so disconnected from her parents, that even though she heard their screams and their cries, that she was able to sit there, passionless, and just allow this crime to continue.
Her brother was in fight or flight mode, so Tia's action really went unnoticed.
20 minutes after the attack, paramedics arrive. Cradled in Jeffrey's arms, Paul takes his last breath. And a severely wounded Mara is rushed to the hospital for emergency surgery for excessive stab wounds. Yale County Police question Jeffrey and Tia, hoping to get some answers on the night's tragic events.
A first responder approached Tia while she was outside and informed her that her father had passed away and that her mother had been rushed to the hospital. And she showed no signs of emotion. She did respond by saying she wanted to go back in the house to retrieve her cell phone.
Mind if I run in and grab my cell phone?
It's really remarkable that she remained so calm during this situation. But the reality is that her actions caused a severe rift in time and destiny for her parents, for her family, and certainly for her siblings.
Her lack of emotion is suspicious, and investigators are even more convinced she's involved when they find a telltale piece of evidence.
Police searching the grounds outside the privacy fence found the hand-drawn map that Tia had drawn with the crooked words printed, "My house."
When confronted with the map, she confesses, but isn't completely honest.
She eventually gave up James and Jonathan's names, and she admitted her involvement in the planning to kill her parents. But she said she called it off and they did it without her. So essentially she turned on her boyfriend.
Tia was just resolute in saving her own skin. So she did what she thought she had to do, even if it meant turning on the guy that she did this all for.
Tia is arrested and taken into custody. Jonathan and James are arrested the following morning at their homes, 20 minutes down the road. Less than a year later, Tia Skinner, Jonathan Kurtz, and James Preston are tried together as co-conspirators in the murder and attempted murder of Paul and Mara Skinner.
When the trio went to court, they took opposing positions. James and Jonathan tried to blame Tia, as the whole thing was her idea. Tia, on the other hand, took the blame on James and Jonathan.
Miraculously, Mara Skinner makes a full recovery and testifies against her daughter in court. All three are found guilty and sentenced to life without parole.
Being 17, 18 years old, and to come to the realization that now you are going to have to spend the rest of your natural life in prison. Now you're going to have to pay the price. You're going to have to pay for the crime by doing that time. Your life is over.
The Skinners stand against Tia and make statements during sentencing.
The family doesn't have a relationship with Tia, nor do they have the desire to have a relationship with Tia. It's almost as if they feel like the night that they lost Paul, they also lost Tia.
After sentencing, Tia never sees Jonathan again.
Tia has not offered an explanation for why she did what she did, although she has apologized to the family and written family members individual letters of apology.
Now that Tia has the time to sit in prison and look back at her life, she can't help but think what she gave up, that she had loving parents, that she had a loving family, and that she threw it all away trying to pursue young love.
Tia Skinner sacrificed her father's life for a boy she'd known for only 2 weeks. Some 40 miles south, in Detroit, Michigan, Renyatta Hamilton shared a willingness to make someone else pay the price to keep the love of her man. But her journey seems to start off on the right track.
Renyatta grew up in Detroit suburbs. She lived in middle-class neighborhoods. There wasn't a lot of violence. There weren't bad communities.
She had a pretty decent home life. There was no abuse in the home, and it was a loving family. She had close family ties.
By the age of 20, Renyatta's days are booked down to the minute.
Renyatta was working at a fast food restaurant, taking on as many shifts as she could, as well as she was attending college. She was in the accounting program at Baker College studying business. She was in a cycle in her life where most of her time was taken up by school and by work.
And nothing slows down her go-getter spirit. She's willing to make great sacrifice to push through the stress of her work-college balance.
She was staying with her cousin in Clinton Township and his friend, Brian, which was a one-bedroom apartment, and she was willing to sleep on the floor just so she could be close to school and close to work.
Renyatta was a worker bee. This is a young woman who worked her tail off at school, who worked as much as possible in order to make money and to survive. When she gave her all.
But all work and no play proves to be a lonely way to spend her 20s. And Renyatta gets tired of going it alone.
Yeah, she was a hopeless romantic. She loved the classic romantic movies, and she kind of longed, I think, for that sort of a relationship, someone to be that knight in shining armor.
But the man who is going to sweep her off her feet is a far cry from the Romeo she desires.
She was headed somewhere, and she allowed him to pull her into his dark little world.
And Renyatta Hamilton throws it all away for approval from her man.
Only her desire to be in that relationship would have had her make such a poor decision.
Your glasses can change the way you see the world. They can be bold, polished, complex, or unexpected. Find your perfect pair at Warby Parker. Or maybe your perspective is artful, simple, sharp, and classic. Find your perfect pair at Warby Parker, starting at $95, including prescription lenses.
All my love scattered everywhere.
When he looked at me, I just melted.
Dreams so sweet turned into a nightmare.
I didn't suspect that he was a straight-out killer demon. I knew I was in trouble. That's a hell of a price to pay. Just for one damn man.
20-year-old Renyatta Hamilton works part-time and is on track to graduate college in a Detroit suburb, but she's distracted by her desire to find a man.
The fact that she had never really had a serious relationship kind of fueled her desire to have a man in her life.
That's why she rushes in with the first man that catches her eye. And despite his unemployment, 21-year-old Larry Stewart's dazzling smile captivates a love-crazed Renyatta.
Renyatta was hanging out with some of her friends, and they introduced her to Larry Stewart. Renyatta was initially attracted to Larry because he was thin and toned, and Renyatta was kind of on the heavy-set side, so her ideal man was exactly the opposite.
Larry knows a good girl when he sees one, so he wastes no time getting her number.
I want to get to know you better, that's all.
Renyatta may like Larry's swagger, but it's no act, and Renyatta learns she's bitten off a little more than she can chew.
Larry was a criminal. His criminal history included domestic violence, obstructing police, marijuana possession, and assault with a dangerous weapon. Not the kind of guy you want to take home to mom and dad.
For Larry to have such a lengthy criminal history by the age of 21, you have to look back to his upbringing. Probably was very dysfunctional, probably didn't have many opportunities, but certainly this was a person who didn't make the right choices because possibly the choices weren't really there for him.
But when her friends tell her about Larry's past, she decides to take her chances and give him a shot.
She was just happy to have someone to love and be loved by.
With her new bad boy around, Renyatta breaks out of her shell and starts to live a little.
Larry was able to take her out of that humdrum study work existence. He didn't have much money because he wasn't working, but he was a warm body, someone who showed her affection, and that was very important to her.
Larry started coming over to the apartment almost every day and sleeping over.
Even though she shares the apartment with cousin Justin and roommate Brian, Renyatta and Larry make a space for themselves together on the living room floor most nights. And she showers him with love every chance she gets.
She had been spending what little money she had on Larry, making sure that he was fed, buying him gifts. She was doing everything she could to maintain that relationship.
It's quite possible that living the existence she had, where it was really all work and all study and sleeping on a living room floor, Larry brought her love, and that was probably the only bright spot in her life at that point.
5 months into the relationship, Larry drops a bombshell when he tells Renyatta he owes $250 to a loan shark. Without a job, he doesn't have the money to pay it back. What's more, if he doesn't pay up soon, his life may be in danger.
Larry wasn't shy to ask people to help him. He was getting in over his head. He was trying to find ways to get money without really having to work.
She jumps into action, trying to clear Larry of his debt.
So Renyatta paid $100 of Larry's debt to this bad guy.
She was in love with somebody who didn't have her best interest at heart. She was in love with somebody who was going to do what he wanted and use anybody in his path to help him.
For Renyatta to give $100 to Larry to pay off the guy that he owed, some people would say, well, what's the big deal? That's not a lot of money. But for Renyatta, who was barely making it by financially, it was a major sacrifice, but one she gladly made because she loved Larry.
Despite Renyatta's generosity, Larry's still concerned for his life. And she can't imagine life without him, so she's willing to help him any way she can.
Larry proposed robbing someone. Renyatta bought into this plan. She really wanted to try to save Larry.
Are you with me?
Most couples at that stage of relationship begin to commit to one another. Renyatta and Larry decided to commit a crime.
All my love scattered everywhere.
When he looked at me, I just melted.
Dreams so sweet turned into a nightmare.
I didn't suspect that he was a straight-out killer demon. I knew I was in trouble. That's a hell of a price to pay. Just for one damn man.
Just outside Detroit, Michigan, 20-year-old Renyatta Hamilton has fallen in love with 21-year-old Larry Stewart. And now, she's willing to do anything to save her man's life from a loan shark.
Larry owed money, and Renyatta had only been able to pay $100 of it. Larry suggested to Renyatta that they plan to rob people so he could get money.
Are you with me?
Blinded by love, she joins forces with her criminal boyfriend to come up with the perfect robbery.
One thing that's very clear about Renyatta was she was dedicated and she was a worker bee. So when this plan came up by Larry to rob someone, she gave that her all. No matter how dangerous, she was willing to make it work.
And on her way to work, a few days later, Renyatta runs into 21-year-old Kevin Brown.
Kevin Brown was infatuated with Renyatta. Kevin worked at a local factory, and when he got off work, he typically went through the drive-thru and saw Renyatta's face. He flirted with her a lot.
As usual, she keeps Kevin hanging for the chance at a real date.
It truly is ironic that Renyatta, someone who really cherished love and wanted that in her life, would take someone like Kevin for granted. She disregarded him, treated him as if he was less than nothing.
And despite the continued rejection, Kevin hopes for a change of heart, though Renyatta's heart is in Larry's hands.
Renyatta was at home with Larry and mentioned to him that she had spoken to Kevin Brown. Larry knew about Kevin Brown. He had seen him driving a nice car, flashing wads of money, and that gave Larry his bright idea.
Kevin would cash his paychecks and keep the wad in his pocket. Larry thought that there would be hundreds, if not $1,000 in his pocket.
Larry believes Kevin's an easy target, but he'll need Renyatta's help in order to reel him in.
Think about it. I'm gonna call you though.
How you do that?
The plan was for Renyatta to set Kevin up by telling him to pick her up for a date. When he came to pick her up, Larry would be hiding in the hallway and would jump out and rob him.
She puts the plan in motion and reaches out to Kevin with a private invitation to her apartment.
You can pick me up at my house Monday morning, okay? He's down, it's done.
For the first time in her life, Renyatta got what she always wanted, the love of a man. And at this point, she was willing to do anything in order to keep that relationship, even if it meant putting the life of another man on the line.
The following Monday, Renyatta awaits Kevin's arrival for their much-anticipated date.
She called Kevin to give him directions to the apartment, but they ended up staying on the phone the entire time. But she was also on the phone through call waiting with Larry.
Larry waits in the hallway outside Renyatta's door.
She was able to verify the type of car that Kevin was in, what Kevin was wearing, and she of course relayed that information to Larry so he knew who to look out for.
He's driving a Lexus truck and he had on flannel and some jeans.
Kevin got out of the car and walked into the apartment building. Renyatta was listening by the door inside her apartment.
An anxious Kevin makes his way to her apartment.
Before Kevin could knock on Renyatta's front door, Larry came rushing at him with the gun out in hand pointed at him.
To Larry's surprise, this is not going to be easy. Kevin Brown is ready for a fight.
Kevin Brown, in fact, grabbed the gun in Larry Stewart's hand, and the two of them began to struggle.
Renyatta watches the fight through the peephole. That's when the shots ring out.
Immediately after the struggle started, 2 rounds were fired.
One of the bullets went right through the front door of Renyatta's apartment. A shot went off.
Oh my God, Larry.
And then a second shot went off. That one pierced the door and struck Renyatta in the stomach.
Renyatta allowed this crime to take place so close to her home, right in front of her door, because in many ways she was in denial as to what could really happen. She just thought it was going to be a simple robbery and life would go on.
As Renyatta Hamilton watches through the peephole of her apartment door in Detroit, Michigan, her boyfriend Larry Stewart attempts to rob Kevin Brown. That's when 2 gunshots ring out.
The 2 rounds that were fired, one not only went through Kevin Brown, it went through the wall and struck Renyatta Hamilton.
Renyatta looked down at her stomach and realized she'd been shot. Her cousin Justin heard the gunshots and rushed out of the bedroom. He saw that she'd been shot and told her to go to the bathroom to clean up.
In the hall, in spite of his gunshot wounds, Kevin is fighting for his life. He wrestles Larry for control of the gun.
Kevin and Larry wound up tumbling down the stairs towards the front door. In the course of the fighting, Kevin was shot, but he still had strength enough to gain control of the gun. And he chased Larry away.
A severely wounded Kevin collapses on the sidewalk.
So during the course of this whole gunfight, Larry was actually shot once in the bicep. Kevin was shot 4 times, twice in the chest, once in the back, and once in the leg.
Back upstairs, Renyatta's too afraid to step outside. Instead, she calls Larry to make sure he's okay.
Larry? Larry answered the phone, and Renyatta told him that she'd been shot.
I need you right now. I've been shot.
Girl, I was shot too.
He told her that he'd been shot too, and to call 911. Then he hung up.
When Clinton Township police arrive to the scene, they discover Kevin laying on the sidewalk, clinging to life.
Kevin never told him what happened. Kevin's concern was so great for his life. All he could focus on was repeatedly asking for an ambulance.
As Kevin's rushed to the hospital, police become aware that a second victim from the apartment is being transported to the emergency room.
At that time, they thought that she was just the victim of a stray bullet.
Now that police are aware that the 2 victims know each other, they hope Renyatta can provide more information on what was behind the shooting.
She told them that that was her date and that he was on his way to pick her up.
But they are held off on further questioning until both victims are treated. In the ER, Renyatta and Kevin are placed in adjoining rooms, separated by a curtain. Luckily for her, she was only grazed, and the wound looks worse than it is. But Kevin is not so fortunate.
Kevin succumbed to his injuries. When Renyatta found out that Kevin had died, her reaction was cold and emotionless. All she said was, "Oh no."
It's sad to think that what Kevin saw as an opportunity to finally be with Renyatta, to find some love, actually ended up in his demise.
While Renyatta is in the hospital, her roommate Brian starts talking to detectives.
Brian told the police that he had seen Renyatta and Larry with a gun just the night before.
Police realize that Renyatta's covering for her boyfriend. They head back to her hospital room where she's discharged, and they take her down to the police station.
Larry Stewart.
Feeling cornered, Renyatta gives up her loyalty to Larry to save her own skin.
Renyatta told police that it was just supposed to be a robbery and that no one was supposed to get hurt, and that her role was simply to lure Kevin to that apartment building.
She's placed under arrest for the murder of Kevin Brown. Meanwhile, Larry is on the run. He is moving from house to house, attempting to evade capture.
Once the police knew Larry Stewart was involved, they got a photograph. The media was called. His picture was placed on all the newscasts. Nobody knew where he was. The police continued to work every tip that came in.
Then, 2 days after the murder, Larry Stewart turns himself into the Clinton Township Police Station. He's not seen a doctor since his gunshot wound to the arm, and he's weak and desperate for medical attention.
He turned himself in because he ran out of options. He's got nowhere to go. He also probably knows if you go to the hospital with a gunshot wound, they have to call the police. One of the first things he tells the police is he's cold, and he's hungry, and he's in pain.
He is treated for his wound, then he is immediately taken into custody. 7 months after the murder, Renyatta Hamilton and Larry Stewart are tried for murder.
Both Larry and Renyatta were tried together because they did the crime together. They planned the crime and carried out the crime together.
Neither blame each other for Kevin's death, but neither take responsibility either.
Renyatta's defense was, though she helped bring him there, she didn't know there was going to be a robbery. She didn't know that Larry was going to use the gun.
Larry told police that he thought Renyatta was cheating on him with Kevin. So he, that morning, confronted Kevin, and Kevin is the one that pulled the gun. So Larry says he was just defending himself.
6 months after Kevin's murder, Renyatta Hamilton and Larry Stewart are convicted of armed robbery, murder, and conspiracy. Both are given mandatory life sentences without parole.
I really do think that she thought that her penalties, if convicted, would be much less than what Larry would get because he's the trigger man. I don't think she realized at all that she was going to be looking at life in prison.
Renyatta made choices based on her heart and not her head, and the consequences were disastrous. The death of an innocent man, and Renyatta herself now spending the rest of her life in jail.
I would hope that she's regretful. I mean, for the love of a man, you throw it all away. It's mind-boggling, but some people are desperate for love and affection, no matter how it comes. I would hope that Renyatta Hamilton has some regrets for participating in the murder of Kevin Brown.
This is truly a tragic ending to this girl's first and only chance at love. She'll never have another chance at romance again.
Renyatta was in love. It was Renyatta who loved Larry. It was Renyatta who sacrificed for Larry. It was Renyatta who changed her life for Larry. And in the end, he didn't love her. And what she did for him cost Kevin Brown his life.
Verna McLean finds both a new life and a new love in Houston, Texas.
He was cute, he was young, he was just what she was looking for.
And her desire to keep him will drive her to the extreme.
Verna's gonna get whatever she wants, even if someone has to die.
Verna did all of this for one reason, and that was to keep a man in her life.
And later in Florida, Shakita Jones falls hard for a sweet-talking Romeo.
Jesse was this guy who seemed to be what any young woman would desire.
Whose out-of-control drug habit forces her into a life of crime.
Miss Jones brought a gunman, violence, and greed to that gas station. She knew that somebody was going to be robbed.
Shakita Jones did what her boyfriend wanted.
There are hundreds of thousands of women in prison at any given time in the U.S. These are the true stories of women who committed heinous crimes in the name of love. For my man. As a young child growing up in a single-parent home in Oakland, California, Verna McLean always felt that she could lean on her mother.
Her mom was the one that was the role model in her life. Her mom was the main focus of her life. They were very close.
But when Verna's mother and sister leave her behind to move to Houston, Texas, the now 23-year-old is fine with it. She's fallen for a man named Theo McLean, who whisks her away to San Diego, where for the next 4 years, she splits her time between raising children and being a nurse.
This woman was a nurse.
The video begins the way many disturbing things on the internet do, without warning, without context, just a cold, indifferent frame that dares you to keep watching. There is no music to guide your emotions, no narrator to tell you what you are about to see. Just a room, dim light,
a bed,
a figure moving with unsettling calm, and somewhere behind the camera, an intention that feels less like impulse and more like design. This was not chaos. This was choreography. And at the center of it all was Luca Magnotta, a man who didn't just commit a crime, he staged it. What makes this moment so difficult to process is not only the brutality that unfolds, but the awareness that it was meant to be seen. Every angle, every pause, every movement carries a disturbing sense of awareness, as if the person behind it all wasn't trying to hide, but to be noticed, to be remembered, to exist, finally, in the eyes of others. And for a brief moment, before the horror fully settles in, there is confusion. Because this doesn't feel like reality at first. It feels like something constructed, something artificial. The internet has trained us that way. We scroll past violence disguised as fiction, cruelty masked as performance, always assuming there is a line somewhere, a boundary that won't be crossed. But here, that line is gone. And the realization comes slowly, like a weight pressing down on your chest. This is real. Somewhere in Montreal, behind the walls of an ordinary apartment, something irreversible has already happened. And what you are seeing is not just evidence of a crime. It is the crime itself, preserved, packaged, and released into the world like a message. But the video is only the surface. The true story doesn't begin here. It begins much earlier, in smaller, quieter moments that didn't seem dangerous at the time. A young man sitting alone in front of a screen, refreshing pages, waiting for notifications that never come. A carefully edited photograph uploaded into the void, hoping anyone will notice. A name that isn't quite real, an identity built piece by piece until the reflection in the mirror feels less important than the one staring back from a digital profile. Long before the world would learn the name Luca Magnotta, there was just a person trying to be seen. But attention, once it becomes a need rather than a desire, can distort everything around it. It changes the way you measure your worth. It rewrites the rules of what is acceptable. And when ordinary methods fail, when the photos, the lies, the performances don't bring the recognition you crave, the mind begins to search for something louder, something impossible to ignore. There were signs. Not the kind that trigger immediate action, but the kind that linger at the edges, unsettling but easy to dismiss. Videos that surfaced online, showing acts of cruelty that felt deliberate, calculated. Not hidden, not accidental, but presented. Shared. Watched. People reacted, of course. They always do. There was outrage, disgust, attempts to track down the person responsible. But the internet is vast, and attention is fleeting. For many, it was just another disturbing clip in an endless stream of content. Something to react to, then move past. But for a few, it felt different. They noticed patterns, details that repeated, a sense that whoever was behind those videos wasn't just acting out, they were escalating, testing boundaries, seeing how far they could go before someone stopped them. And yet, no one did. Not in time. The story moves forward, but it doesn't accelerate immediately. It lingers in that uncomfortable space where something feels wrong, but not yet urgent. Where the pieces exist, but haven't been connected. And in that space, the person at the center continues to build, to refine, to prepare. Because this isn't about a single moment of violence. It's about a progression. A transformation that doesn't happen overnight, but unfolds gradually, almost invisibly, until the final act feels less like a sudden break and more like the inevitable conclusion of a path that was never interrupted. When the name June Lin enters the story, it does so quietly. There is no dramatic introduction, no warning that this is the moment everything changes. Just a person living a life, moving through a city, carrying hopes that have nothing to do with the darkness about to intersect with them. And that contrast, the ordinary meeting the unthinkable, is what gives this story its weight. Because what happened was not the result of two forces colliding in equal measure. It was the intrusion of something calculated into a life that had no reason to expect it. And when that moment finally arrives, when the quiet progression gives way to action, it does so with a kind of stillness that is more disturbing than chaos. There is no explosion, no sudden frenzy, just decisions being carried out, step, by someone who has already imagined them long before they became real. The aftermath spreads quickly, not just through physical evidence, but through digital space. Links shared, screens refreshed, reactions multiplying faster than they can be contained. The world becomes aware almost in real time, but awareness doesn't bring understanding. Not immediately, because what people are trying to process isn't just what happened, it's why it was shown, why it was turned into something meant to be consumed. And that question lingers, even as the investigation begins, even as the search for answers takes shape. This is where the story truly begins. Not with the crime itself, but with the realization that it was never meant to stay hidden. That the person behind it wanted this moment, this attention, this reaction. And in that realization, something shifts. Because this is no longer just a case of violence. It is something more unsettling. A performance. A message. A reflection of a world where being seen can become more important than being human. Long before the name Luca Magnotta appeared in headlines, long before investigators began tracing digital footprints across continents, the story was already unfolding quietly, almost invisibly, in the background of an ordinary life. It began in places that didn't feel dangerous at all: suburban streets, small apartments, routine days that blended into one another without drawing attention. There was nothing in the environment itself that hinted at what would eventually emerge. No dramatic setting, no obvious signs. Just the slow passage of time, and within it, a growing need that would shape everything that followed. Born as Eric Clinton Newman in 1982, he grew up in a world that, on the surface, offered the same possibilities as anyone else's. But the inner landscape told a different story. There was a quiet instability there, something difficult to define but impossible to ignore if you looked closely enough. People who encountered him at different points in his life often described a sense of inconsistency, as if he was constantly shifting between versions of himself, trying on identities the way others might change clothes. It wasn't just about reinvention. It was about construction. A deliberate, ongoing effort to create a version of himself that could exist beyond the limitations of his real life. As the internet became more accessible, that effort found a new and powerful outlet. Online, the rules were different. You could be anyone, say anything, present yourself in whatever way you chose. And for someone who felt unseen or not seen in the way they wanted, this wasn't just appealing, it was transformative. Profiles could be edited. Images could be altered. Stories could be rewritten. And slowly, the gap between reality and performance began to widen. The name Luca Magnotta wasn't just a pseudonym. It was a persona, carefully assembled and constantly maintained. Photos were retouched to perfection, angles chosen to create a specific impression. Claims were made about modeling careers, acting roles, connections to people who had no idea who he was. And for a while, it worked, at least on the surface. There were reactions, comments, moments of attention that fed the very thing he was chasing. But attention on the internet is unpredictable. It comes and goes, often without warning, leaving behind a silence that can feel louder than any noise. And for someone who depends on it, that silence isn't neutral. It's suffocating. The more he invested in this constructed identity, the more fragile it became. Because it required constant reinforcement, constant validation. Without it, the illusion began to crack. And instead of stepping back, instead of letting the performance fade, he pushed further. Deeper. Louder. There were glimpses of this escalation, moments that, in hindsight, stand out as clear warnings. But at the time, they were scattered, disconnected, easy to overlook. Online communities are vast, and content moves quickly. What shocks people one day is forgotten the next. And in that constant flow, it's possible for something deeply disturbing to exist without triggering immediate intervention. The early videos that surfaced didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were part of a progression, a testing of boundaries. Each act more deliberate than the last, each one revealing a little more about the mindset behind it. But even then, The connection between the online persona and the real individual remained unclear. It was like watching fragments of a puzzle without knowing what the full picture looked like. Meanwhile, in the physical world, life continued. In cities like Montreal, people moved through their routines, unaware of how close they were to intersecting with something far more dangerous than it appeared. The city itself was alive with ordinary details, traffic lights changing, conversations drifting through cafe windows, footsteps echoing on sidewalks after rain. It was the kind of place where stories begin every day, most of them quiet, unremarkable, human. And within that environment, it was easy for someone to blend in, to exist without drawing attention, to maintain the separation between the person and the persona. But that separation wasn't stable. It couldn't be, because the more the online identity grew, the more it demanded to be sustained in reality. And sustaining it required more than images and words. It required action, something tangible, something that could break through the noise and force the world to look, to react, to remember. This is where the setting shifts, not in location but in tone. The same streets, the same buildings, the same ordinary spaces begin to feel different when viewed through the lens of what is about to happen. Because the environment hasn't changed, but the intention within it has. And that intention moves quietly, without announcement, without spectacle, until it reaches a point where it can no longer remain hidden. The tragedy of this stage of the story is that nothing seems out of place. There are no alarms, no immediate triggers that demand intervention. Just a series of choices, each one building on the last, each one bringing the narrative closer to a moment that will finally force everything into the open. And by the time that moment arrives, the groundwork has already been laid. The persona is complete. The need for attention has reached its peak. And the line between performance and reality has disappeared entirely. What remains is a setting that, on the surface, looks exactly the same, but beneath it, something irreversible is already in motion. Before his name became part of a global investigation, before it was repeated across headlines and courtroom transcripts, Junlin existed in a way that rarely draws attention. Not because his life lacked meaning, but because it followed a path that millions of others walk quietly every day, one shaped by effort, hope, and the simple determination to build something better than what came before. He was born in China and, like many young people, carried with him a vision that extended far beyond the place he started. It wasn't a grand, cinematic ambition. It was something more grounded, more human. The kind of dream that takes form slowly, through small decisions and steady work, rather than sudden breakthroughs. Choosing to study abroad was one of those decisions. It meant distance, uncertainty, and the challenge of adapting to a world that felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. When he arrived in Montreal, the city didn't greet him with dramatic change. Instead, it unfolded gradually. New streets to learn, new rhythms to understand, a different language echoing through everyday interactions. For someone like Junlin, this wasn't overwhelming, it was something to be navigated, step by step. He enrolled as a student, focusing on his studies with the kind of quiet discipline that often goes unnoticed. Those who knew him described a presence that didn't demand attention. He wasn't loud, not the kind of person who filled a room with his voice. But he was steady, reliable, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke, who observed before reacting. There is a particular kind of strength in that, though it's rarely recognized in dramatic ways. It shows itself in consistency, in the ability to move forward without needing validation at every step. Outside of his studies, life required balance. Like many international students, he worked part-time to support himself. The details of those shifts, late hours, routine tasks, brief interactions with strangers, might seem insignificant when viewed from a distance. But they were part of his reality, part of the structure that allowed him to remain in a place far from home. There is something deeply human about that effort, about the willingness to endure small hardships in pursuit of a future that isn't guaranteed. And within that routine, there were moments of normalcy. Conversations with classmates, messages exchanged with family across time zones, meals eaten alone or with friends, depending on the day. These are the kinds of details that don't make headlines, but they define a life. They create a sense of continuity, of presence, of being part of something larger than oneself. And it's precisely this ordinariness that makes what follows so difficult to process. Because there is no indication, in these moments, that anything is about to change. No sign that this path, built carefully over time, is about to intersect with something completely outside its logic. The world Junlin inhabited was not one of danger or risk. It was structured, predictable, grounded in effort and intention. And that makes the contrast all the more stark. Because when his story intersects with that of Luca Magnotta, it is not a meeting of equals, not a collision of two forces moving toward each other. It is an intrusion. One life, moving forward with quiet purpose, crossing paths with another that has already begun to unravel in ways that are hidden from view. There is a moment, though it cannot be precisely defined, when that intersection becomes inevitable. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with warning. It exists first as a possibility, then as a decision, and finally as a reality that cannot be undone. And within that progression, Junlin remains exactly who he has always been, a person with plans, with connections, with a future that extends beyond the present moment. That future is what gives his story its weight, because it represents everything that was interrupted. Not just a life, but a trajectory. A series of experiences that will never unfold, conversations that will never happen, moments that will never exist. It's easy, in the context of a crime this widely known, to focus on the perpetrator, on the details that shock and disturb. But doing so risks overshadowing something essential. The fact that at the center of it all is a person who lived, who moved through the world in a way that was meaningful, even if it wasn't dramatic or widely recognized. And remembering that requires a shift in perspective. It means slowing down, paying attention to the details that don't demand attention, recognizing the value in a life that wasn't defined by the way it ended. In many ways, Junlin's story is one of continuity, of effort, adaptation, quiet resilience. And it's precisely that continuity that makes its abrupt end so difficult to reconcile. Because there is no natural conclusion here, no sense of completion. Only interruption. Only the sudden absence of something that should have continued. And in that absence, there is a silence that lingers. Not empty, but filled with the weight of everything that could have been. There is a moment in every story where possibility collapses into reality, where everything that could have happened narrows into what actually does, and from that point on, nothing can be undone. In this case, that moment unfolds behind a closed door in an ordinary apartment in Montreal, a space that, until then, held no visible trace of what it was about to contain. The walls were the same as any other, the furniture unremarkable, the air still carrying the quiet anonymity of a place that had never drawn attention. And yet, within that contained space, a sequence of decisions began to take shape, deliberate, controlled, and already imagined long before they were set into motion. When Junlin entered that apartment, there was no visible shift in the outside world. The city continued as it always had, indifferent to what was happening within one of its countless rooms. Lights changed at intersections, footsteps echoed along sidewalks, conversations carried on without interruption. It is this contrast, the continuity of the outside world against the rupture inside, that gives the moment its unsettling weight. Because from the outside, nothing appears wrong. There is no signal, no disruption, nothing to suggest that a life is about to be irreversibly altered. Inside, however, the atmosphere begins to change, not through sudden chaos, but through a controlled stillness. The kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from intention. Luca Magnotta does not act impulsively. There is no frantic energy, no visible loss of control. Instead, there is a methodical progression, each action following the last with a disturbing sense of purpose. It is this absence of visible hesitation that makes the scene so difficult to process. Because what unfolds is not a reaction, it is execution. The presence of the camera transforms everything. It is not hidden, not incidental, but central. Positioned deliberately, it becomes more than a passive observer. It is part of the act itself, shaping the way movements are made, the way time is measured, the way the entire event is constructed. This is no longer just an act of violence. It is a performance designed to be replayed, to be witnessed by people who are not there, who will encounter it later through a screen. And that awareness alters the nature of the moment. It introduces a second layer, one that exists beyond the physical space of the apartment. A layer where intention extends outward, where the act is not confined to a single location but is meant to travel, to spread, to be consumed. As the sequence unfolds, there is a disturbing clarity in the way everything is carried out. The lack of interruption, the absence of external interference, allows the progression to continue uninterrupted. Time moves differently in this space. It stretches, compresses, loses its usual rhythm. What might take seconds feels extended, deliberate, as if each moment is being shaped, preserved, made to last beyond its natural duration. And within that distorted sense of time, the reality of what is happening becomes increasingly unavoidable. There is no point at which the situation reverses, no moment where it shifts back into something that can be controlled or undone. It moves forward, step by step, toward an outcome that has already been decided. Outside, nothing changes. The world remains intact, unaware. And that indifference is part of what makes the event so isolating. Because within that apartment, something irreversible has already occurred, and yet it exists in a kind of isolation, separated from the broader reality that continues without acknowledging it. This separation will not last. It cannot, because the act itself is not meant to remain hidden. It is designed to emerge, to cross the boundary between private space and public awareness. And when it does, the reaction will be immediate, widespread, impossible to contain. But in this moment, before that transition happens, there is only the contained reality of the scene itself. The controlled environment, the deliberate actions, the presence of a camera that ensures nothing will remain confined for long. The finality of what occurs does not arrive with a dramatic shift. There is no sudden marker that clearly defines the end. Instead, it settles in gradually, as the sequence completes itself, as the movement stops, as the space becomes still once again. But this stillness is not the same as before. It carries a different weight now, a different meaning. Because what remains is not just a room, not just objects arranged in familiar ways, but the aftermath of something that cannot be reversed. And from this point forward, everything that follows, the investigation, the pursuit, the public reaction will trace back to this moment. This contained, controlled, deliberate sequence that began in silence and will soon echo far beyond the walls that first held it. The first signs that something was wrong did not arrive in a single, clear message. They emerged in fragments, disconnected, unsettling, easy to dismiss if viewed in isolation. A package that didn't feel right in the hands of the person who received it. A smell that lingered longer than it should. A weight that seemed inconsistent with its label. These were not immediate alarms, not at first. Just small disruptions in routine, the kind that might cause a pause, a second glance, before being set aside. But in this case, those small disruptions began to align, forming a pattern that could no longer be ignored. In different locations across Canada, parcels began to appear, each one carrying within it a piece of something that did not belong in the ordinary flow of daily life. When one of these packages was opened in an office setting, an environment defined by routine, paperwork, predictable tasks, the reaction was immediate and visceral. The room changed instantly. What had been a normal workday collapsed into confusion, then into shock. People stepped back, voices rose, instructions overlapped as the realization spread that this was not a mistake, not an accident, but something intentional. Authorities were called, and within minutes, the space transformed from a workplace into a controlled scene. Investigators arrived not knowing yet the full scope of what they were dealing with, only that the situation demanded precision, containment, and clarity. As more reports came in from other locations, the pattern became undeniable. This was not a single incident. It was a coordinated act, each package part of a larger design. The discovery extended beyond physical parcels. At the same time, online spaces, forums, websites, private message boards began to circulate a video that carried the same unsettling sense of intent. Those who encountered it often did so by accident, following links without fully understanding where they would lead. And once they saw it, the reaction was immediate: disbelief, followed by a growing certainty that what they were witnessing was real. The digital and physical elements of the case began to converge, each reinforcing the other, creating a picture that was both fragmented and deeply connected. In Montreal, investigators turned their attention to the apartment linked to Luca Magnotta. From the outside, the building did not stand out. It was one of many, part of a city landscape that did not reveal what was contained within. But once inside, the environment told a different story, not through dramatic displays, but through details. Objects out of place. Traces that suggested recent activity, but not the kind associated with ordinary living. The air itself felt different, carrying a faint but persistent indication that something had occurred here that did not belong. Investigators moved carefully, documenting everything. Each item, each surface, each mark was treated as a potential piece of a larger puzzle. There is a discipline in this kind of work, a need to remain focused on procedure, even when the context is deeply unsettling. Because the goal is not just to understand what happened, but to build a record that can withstand scrutiny, that can speak clearly in a setting where every detail will be examined. And in that process, the apartment began to reveal its role, not just as a location, but as a stage where multiple elements of the crime had intersected. Meanwhile, the identity of June Lin began to emerge through missing person reports, through connections made between the digital evidence and real-world individuals. What had initially been fragments, an image, a package, a video, started to align around a single narrative. And with that alignment came a shift in understanding. This was no longer an abstract investigation into disturbing materials. It was the reconstruction of a life that had been interrupted, a person whose absence was now being defined by the evidence left behind. The coordination between different agencies became critical. Information moved quickly, crossing jurisdictions, linking physical evidence with digital traces. The scale of the investigation expanded, not just because of the nature of the crime, but because of the way it had been executed. This was not contained within a single location or a single medium. It existed across multiple spaces, each one requiring a different approach, a different set of tools, a different kind of attention. And within that complexity, a clearer picture began to form. The deliberate nature of the actions, the way each element connected to the next, pointed toward a level of planning that could not be dismissed as spontaneous. Every discovery reinforced the same conclusion. This had been constructed, step by step, with an awareness of how it would be found, how it would be seen, how it would be understood. The emotional impact on those involved in the discovery was difficult to contain. Investigators are trained to maintain distance, to focus on the task at hand, but there are moments when that distance becomes harder to sustain. When the accumulation of details, the realization of what they represent, begins to weigh more heavily. And yet, the work continues. Because beyond the immediate reactions, there is a responsibility to document, to analyze, to ensure that what has been uncovered leads to accountability. As the discovery phase unfolded, one thing became increasingly clear. This was only the beginning. The evidence had been found, the connections were forming, but the person responsible was no longer present. The apartment was empty. The trail did not end here. It extended outward, beyond the city, beyond the country. And with that realization, the focus of the investigation shifted. From understanding what had happened to finding the individual who had set it all in motion. By the time the investigation moved beyond the apartment in Montreal, the case had already taken on a complexity that made every new lead feel both promising and uncertain. The evidence was there, physical traces, digital footprints, a pattern that pointed clearly toward intent, but the person at the center of it all, Luca Magnotta, had vanished. And in that absence, the investigation entered a phase defined by questions rather than answers. Where had he gone? How far ahead had he planned? And how much of what he left behind was meant to guide, or mislead, those trying to find him? The challenge was not simply locating a suspect, but navigating a narrative that had been deliberately constructed, one that blurred the line between truth and performance. Early in the process, Investigators began examining his online presence in detail, and what they found was not a straightforward record of activity, but a fragmented, layered identity. Multiple accounts, different names, conflicting stories, all pointing to the same person, yet never fully aligning. It was as if he had spent years rehearsing for this moment, creating versions of himself that could be deployed, abandoned, or reshaped depending on the situation. This made every piece of information difficult to trust at face value. A location mentioned in one account might be contradicted in another. A timeline that seemed consistent could unravel when cross-referenced with other data. The investigation became less about following a clear path and more about filtering through noise, identifying what was real and what had been intentionally distorted. At the same time, attention turned to his past interactions, the people he had communicated with, the environments he had moved through before disappearing. Some described him as quiet, even withdrawn, someone who could blend into a room without drawing attention. Others recalled a different impression, a need to be noticed, a tendency to exaggerate, to present himself in ways that didn't quite match reality. These accounts, while varied, shared a common thread: inconsistency. And that inconsistency became a key element in understanding how he operated, because it suggested an ability to adapt, to shift behavior depending on what was needed in the moment. For investigators, this raised an unsettling possibility. If he had been capable of constructing identities online, of presenting different versions of himself to different people, then tracking him in the physical world would not be straightforward. He might not look the same, act the same, or even use the same name. Every assumption had to be questioned, every lead examined with the awareness that it could be part of a larger misdirection. Meanwhile, the digital evidence continued to expand. The video that had circulated online was analyzed frame by frame, not for its content alone, but for the details embedded within it. Objects in the background, patterns on walls, reflections, anything that could provide a clue about location, timing, or sequence. This level of analysis required patience, precision, and a willingness to focus on elements that might seem insignificant at first glance. Because in a case like this, the smallest detail could shift the entire direction of the investigation. Parallel to this, online communities that had previously tracked the animal cruelty videos began to contribute information. These were individuals who had spent months, even years, analyzing content linked to Luca Magnotta, identifying patterns, connecting accounts, building a profile based on fragments that others might overlook. Their involvement added another layer to the investigation, unofficial, decentralized, but driven by a persistent focus that complemented the formal efforts of law enforcement. However, this also introduced complications. Not all information was verified, and distinguishing between useful leads and speculation became an ongoing challenge. Investigators had to balance openness to external input with the need to maintain accuracy, ensuring that the case remained grounded in evidence rather than assumption. As the search extended beyond Canada, coordination with international agencies became essential. The possibility that he had left the country was no longer hypothetical, it was increasingly likely. Travel records, financial transactions, border crossings, all were examined in an attempt to map his movements. Each confirmed detail provided a new point of reference, but also raised new questions. If he had planned this in advance, then his escape was not random. It followed a structure, a sequence of decisions designed to create distance, to complicate pursuit. And yet, within that structure, there were moments of exposure. Digital traces that suggested continued activity, glimpses of presence that indicated he had not completely disappeared. These moments became focal points, areas where the investigation could concentrate its efforts. But even here, uncertainty remained. Was this activity genuine, or another layer of misdirection? Was he aware of how closely he was being tracked, or was he acting out of habit, unable to fully detach from the need to engage, to observe, to remain connected to the narrative he had created? The psychological dimension of the case became increasingly relevant. Understanding behavior patterns, motivations, tendencies, these were not abstract considerations, but practical tools in narrowing down possibilities. Because if his actions had been driven by a need for attention, then complete invisibility might not be sustainable. There might be a point where that need resurfaced, where the desire to observe the impact of his actions, to see the reaction, became too strong to suppress. And in that possibility lay both risk and opportunity. Risk because it suggested unpredictability. Opportunity because it provided a potential opening. As days passed, the investigation did not slow, but it did shift. From immediate response to sustained pursuit. From reacting to evidence to anticipating movement. And within that shift, the pressure remained constant. Not just to find him, but to do so in a way that ensured the case would hold, that every step taken could be supported, verified, presented without doubt. Because this was no longer just about locating a suspect. It was about building a path from discovery to accountability, one that could withstand the scrutiny that would inevitably come. And somewhere along that path, the distance between the investigators and Luca Magnotta was narrowing, even if it did not yet feel that way. The turning point in a case like this rarely announces itself with certainty. It doesn't arrive as a single revelation that suddenly makes everything clear. Instead, it builds gradually, through a series of small confirmations that begin to align, reducing uncertainty piece by piece until what once felt fragmented starts to take on a defined shape. In the search for Luca Magnotta, that shift began not with a dramatic discovery, but with a pattern, subtle at first, almost easy to overlook, but persistent enough that it demanded attention. Investigators had already traced multiple digital footprints, each one pointing in a slightly different direction, creating a map that was more confusing than helpful. But within that map, certain consistencies began to emerge. Access points that repeated, time frames that overlapped, small details that, when isolated, seemed insignificant, but when viewed together suggested continuity rather than randomness. It was within this growing structure that the first real breakthrough took form. Travel records, once scattered across different jurisdictions, began to align with digital activity in a way that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. A departure from Canada, a sequence of movements through Europe, each step leaving behind a trace, not always obvious, but detectable when viewed through the right lens. These traces were not the result of carelessness, but they revealed something important. Even with planning, even with an attempt to construct distance, complete invisibility is difficult to maintain. Especially for someone whose actions had been so closely tied to observation, to interaction, to the need to remain connected in some form. As the focus shifted toward Europe, coordination intensified. Information moved quickly between agencies, each update narrowing the scope, refining the search. And then, a location began to stand out, not because it was the only possibility, but because it fit the emerging pattern more closely than the others.
Berlin.
A city large enough to blend into, yet structured enough that movement could still be traced. It was here that the abstract began to take on a more concrete form. Reports surfaced, not immediately confirmed, but consistent enough to warrant attention. A sighting. A presence that matched descriptions, not perfectly, but closely enough to raise the possibility that the distance between investigators and their target had narrowed significantly. Surveillance efforts intensified, not in a dramatic, visible way, but through careful observation, verification, cross-referencing. Because at this stage, precision mattered more than speed. Acting too quickly, without confirmation, could result in losing the lead entirely. Acting too slowly could allow it to slip away. The balance between those two risks defined every decision. And then came the moment where possibility became confirmation. Inside an internet cafe in Berlin, a man sat in front of a screen, engaged in an activity that, on the surface, appeared ordinary. Browsing, reading, observing. But what he was observing was not detached from him. It was a reflection of himself. News coverage, updates, the unfolding narrative of the very case that had brought investigators across continents. There is something deeply unsettling about that image, not because of what is happening physically, but because of what it suggests psychologically. The distance between the individual and the event has collapsed. He is no longer just the subject of the investigation. He is also an observer of it, watching the impact of his actions in real time, as if the entire situation exists on two levels simultaneously. When authorities moved in, the moment did not explode into chaos. There was no dramatic chase, no prolonged struggle. Instead, it resolved with a kind of quiet finality. The person who had constructed layers of identity, who had moved across borders, who had left behind a trail both complex and deliberate, was now contained within a single, undeniable reality. Luca Magnotta was in custody. The breakthrough, when viewed from the outside, might appear as a single point in time, a clear before and after. But in reality, it was the result of accumulation. Every detail analyzed, every lead followed, every inconsistency examined had contributed to this moment. It was not luck, though chance always plays a role. It was the convergence of effort, persistence, and the gradual reduction of uncertainty. And yet, even as this phase of the investigation reached its conclusion, another began. Because capturing the individual does not resolve the case. It transforms it. The focus shifts from pursuit to explanation, from finding to understanding. The questions change. No longer centered on where he is, but on how everything unfolded, why it took the shape it did, and how it can be presented in a way that holds up under scrutiny. The arrest marked the end of one trajectory and the beginning of another. A movement from the field into the courtroom, from fragmented evidence into structured argument. And within that transition, the narrative would be tested in a different way, not through pursuit, but through examination. But for a brief moment, before that transition fully takes hold, there is a pause. A recognition that the distance is closed, that the uncertainty is narrowed, that the person at the center of it all is no longer beyond reach. And in that recognition, the weight of everything that has been uncovered begins to settle into a form that can finally be confronted directly. The courtroom does not carry the same kind of tension as the investigation, at least not on the surface. There are no sudden movements, no urgent calls, no shifting locations. Instead, everything is structured, deliberate, contained within a space where time feels slower, more controlled. But beneath that structure lies a different kind of intensity, one that builds not through action, but through exposure. Because this is where the narrative, once scattered across locations and moments, is reconstructed piece by piece, examined under a level of scrutiny that allows nothing to remain undefined. When Luca Magnotta is brought into that space, the transformation is immediate, not in his appearance, but in his role. He is no longer the figure moving through shadows, no longer the subject of a search. He is now at the center of a process that demands clarity, accountability, and coherence. The layers of identity, the shifting narratives, the constructed persona, all of it is now subject to examination in a setting where performance has limits, where every claim must be supported, every contradiction addressed. The proceedings begin with the careful presentation of evidence, not as isolated fragments, but as a sequence that forms a continuous line from intention to action. Each detail is introduced with purpose. The digital traces that once seemed scattered are now aligned, showing patterns of behavior that extend back before the crime itself. The physical evidence recovered from the apartment in Montreal is presented not as shocking discovery, but as documented fact, each element placed within a broader context that explains its relevance. There is a discipline in the way this information is delivered. No dramatic emphasis, no unnecessary embellishment. Because the weight of the material does not require amplification. It exists on its own, in the clarity of its connection to the events being examined. The defense introduces its own narrative, one that attempts to reframe the sequence, to introduce doubt, to suggest that what appears deliberate may have been influenced by factors beyond control. There are references to psychological instability, to the possibility that the actions were not entirely self-directed, that there may have been external influences shaping behavior. These arguments are not presented casually. They are structured, supported by expert testimony, designed to create an alternative framework through which the events can be understood. But within that framework, there are gaps. Points where the explanation does not fully align with the evidence, where the consistency of the actions suggests a level of planning that is difficult to reconcile with the idea of complete loss of control. The prosecution focuses on these gaps, not by dismissing the defense outright, but by returning to the sequence of actions, to the continuity that runs through them. The preparation, the recording, the distribution, the attempt to extend the impact beyond the immediate act. All of it points toward intention. Not a momentary break, but a sustained progression. And it is this progression that becomes central to the argument, because it establishes not just what happened, but how it unfolded, how each step led to the next in a way that reflects decision rather than accident. Throughout the proceedings, the presence of June Lin is maintained not through dramatic statements, but through the consistent acknowledgement of who he was, of the life that existed before it intersected with this case. His story is not reduced to a single moment. It is presented as a continuity that was interrupted, a trajectory that had direction and meaning. This framing is essential, not only for the integrity of the case, but for the balance of the narrative itself. Because without it, the focus risks shifting entirely toward the actions of the perpetrator, overshadowing the reality of what was lost. As the trial progresses, the structure of the case becomes clearer. The connections between evidence points solidify, the sequence becomes more defined, the areas of uncertainty narrow. This does not eliminate complexity, but it organizes it, places it within a framework that allows for evaluation, for judgment. And within that framework, the role of the jury becomes critical. They are not simply observing. They are interpreting, weighing, determining how the pieces fit together, how the narrative holds under examination. The final phase of the trial carries a different kind of weight. The arguments have been made, the evidence presented, the perspectives outlined. What remains is the decision. And when it comes, it does not arrive with dramatic flourish. It is delivered with the same controlled precision that has defined the entire process. The verdict reflects not a single moment, but the accumulation of everything that has been examined. Luca Magnotta is found guilty, the charges aligning with the evidence presented, the sequence of actions, the intent demonstrated throughout the case. The sentencing that follows establishes the consequences in clear terms: life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. There is no ambiguity in that outcome. It is structured, definitive, designed to reflect the severity of what has been established. And yet, even within that finality, there is an awareness that the legal conclusion does not resolve everything. It defines responsibility, it establishes accountability, but it does not erase what has occurred. It does not restore what has been lost. What it does is create a boundary, a point at which the process of examination transitions into something else: reflection, understanding, the ongoing effort to integrate what has happened into a broader context. As the courtroom empties, the structure that held the narrative together begins to dissolve. The formal process concludes, but the implications extend beyond it, continuing in ways that are less visible, less defined, but no less significant. When the courtroom doors close and the structured language of law fades into the background, what remains is something far less defined but far more difficult to contain. The case of Luca Magnotta does not end with a verdict because its impact was never confined to the legal process. It lingers in quieter places, in the way people remember, in the questions that continue to surface long after the official narrative has been completed. There is a natural instinct, after something this disturbing, to move forward quickly, to place distance between the present and what has happened. But some stories resist that movement. They remain, not because people choose to hold on to them, but because they expose something deeper, something that cannot be easily categorized or set aside. In Montreal, life continues with the same outward rhythm. Streets remain busy, lights change, conversations overlap in cafes and public spaces. The city does not pause indefinitely for any single event, no matter how significant. And yet, within that continuity, there is a subtle shift, a heightened awareness, not always visible, but present in the way certain things are perceived. The knowledge that something like this could happen within familiar surroundings alters the way those surroundings are understood. It does not create constant fear, but it introduces a layer of recognition that beneath the ordinary, there can exist realities that are far more complex than they appear. The role of the internet in this case leaves behind an even more complicated legacy. The actions were not only carried out, they were recorded, distributed, observed. This transforms the nature of the crime in a way that extends beyond physical boundaries. It raises questions that do not have simple answers. What does it mean when an act of violence is also an act of communication? When the intention is not only to do, but to show. The digital space, which connects people across distances, also becomes a medium through which harm can be amplified, repeated, preserved. And in that space, the line between observer and participant becomes less clear. People who encounter the material did not choose to be part of the event, and yet they became part of its impact, carrying images and memories that were never meant to remain private. This creates a form of exposure that is difficult to reconcile because it extends the reach of the act far beyond its original moment. At the center of all of this, it is important to return to Jun Lin, not as a symbol, not as a case detail, but as a person whose life existed independently of everything that followed. His story does not begin or end with the crime. It includes the choices he made, the path he was building, the connections he maintained. Remembering that is not an abstract gesture. It is a necessary part of maintaining balance in how the story is understood. Because without that focus, the narrative risks being dominated entirely by the actions of the person who caused harm, rather than the reality of what was lost. There is also a broader reflection that emerges from this case, one that extends beyond individuals to the systems and environments that shape how such events are perceived and addressed. The early signs, the online activity, the patterns that were noticed but not fully acted upon, these elements invite a difficult kind of questioning. Not one that assigns simple blame, but one that examines how awareness is formed, how attention is directed, how decisions are made about what requires intervention and what does not. These are not questions with definitive answers, but they are necessary because they influence how future situations may be approached. The story also challenges assumptions about visibility and invisibility. Luca Magnotta was not entirely hidden. There were traces, signals, moments where his behavior intersected with public awareness. And yet, those moments did not immediately translate into action that could alter the outcome. This highlights a gap between recognition and response, between seeing something and fully understanding its implications. Bridging that gap is not straightforward. It requires coordination, resources, judgment, and often the ability to interpret incomplete information. But acknowledging that gap is a step toward addressing it. As time passes, the intensity of public attention fades, as it always does. New stories emerge, new events take focus. But the significance of this case does not disappear with that shift. It becomes part of a larger context, a reference point that informs how similar situations are viewed in the future. It contributes to an ongoing conversation about responsibility, about the role of technology, about the ways in which individuals and communities respond to signs of harm. And within that conversation, there is space for both reflection and change. Ultimately, what remains is not a single conclusion, but a series of considerations that continue to evolve. The balance between remembering and moving forward. The relationship between visibility and action. The role of individuals within broader systems. These are not resolved by a verdict or a sentence. They persist, shaping the way this story is understood long after its most visible moments have passed. And perhaps that is where its lasting impact lies. Not in the details that shocked the world at the time, but in the quieter, more enduring questions that continue to be asked, even when the headlines are gone. Time does not erase a story like this. It changes the way it lives in memory. What once felt immediate, urgent, almost overwhelming, begins to settle into something quieter, but no less significant. The case connected to Luca Magnotta no longer dominates daily conversation, no longer appears in constant headlines, but it persists in a different form, embedded in discussions about crime, about media, about the evolving relationship between human behavior and digital space. It becomes a reference point, not always named directly, but present in the way certain patterns are recognized more quickly, in the way certain warning signs are taken more seriously than they might have been before. In Montreal, the physical locations tied to the case have returned to their ordinary functions. Buildings are occupied, streets are filled, routines continue without visible interruption. To someone passing through, there is nothing to indicate what once occurred there. And yet, for those who are aware of the history, the space carries an additional layer of meaning, one that exists alongside the present without disrupting it. This duality, The coexistence of normalcy and memory is a common outcome in cases like this. The environment does not change, but the perception of it does. And that shift, though subtle, influences how people relate to the space, even if only on a subconscious level. The digital dimension of the case evolves differently. Unlike physical locations, which can return to a state of apparent normalcy, digital content does not disappear in the same way. It can be removed, restricted, made harder to access, but traces remain. References persist, discussions continue, fragments resurface in new contexts. This creates a kind of permanence that is difficult to fully control. It means that the impact of the original act extends far beyond its initial moment, continuing to exist in a space where time operates differently, where past and present can overlap without clear boundaries. This raises ongoing questions about responsibility, not only for those who create such content, but for the platforms that host it, the systems that regulate it, and the individuals who encounter it. These questions do not have fixed answers because the environment itself is constantly changing. Technology evolves, new forms of interaction emerge, and with them, new challenges in defining what should be visible, what should be restricted, and how to balance openness with protection. Within this broader context, the story of June Lin remains a central point of grounding. It is a reminder that behind every discussion, every analysis, every policy consideration, there is a human reality that cannot be reduced to abstraction. His life, his presence, his absence. These are not theoretical elements. They are the core of what gives the entire narrative its weight. And maintaining that focus is essential because it prevents the story from becoming detached from its most important dimension. There is also a personal aspect to how stories like this are carried forward. For some, it becomes a point of reflection, a moment that shifts the way they think about safety, about awareness, about the signals that might indicate something is wrong. For others, it fades more quickly, absorbed into the broader flow of information that defines modern life. Both responses are part of a larger pattern, one that reflects the diversity of ways in which people process and retain experience. But regardless of the individual response, the story contributes to a collective understanding, a shared framework that influences how similar situations are perceived in the future. In this sense, the case does not exist in isolation. It becomes part of a network of narratives that inform each other, that create points of comparison, that shape expectations. When new incidents occur, they are often interpreted through the lens of what has come before, and in that process, the lessons, both explicit and implicit, continue to circulate. This is how impact extends beyond the original event, not through constant attention, but through integration into a broader context. There is a tendency to look for closure in stories like this, a clear endpoint that signals resolution. But closure, in its simplest form, is rarely available. The legal process provides one kind of conclusion, but it does not address every dimension of the experience. It does not resolve the questions that remain, the uncertainties that persist, the reflections that continue to evolve over time. Instead, what emerges is a different kind of ending, one that is less about finality and more about continuation. A recognition that the story has reached a point where it no longer unfolds through new events, but through ongoing interpretation. And within that interpretation, there is space for learning, for adjustment, for the gradual shaping of responses that may influence future outcomes. This does not undo what has happened, but it ensures that the impact is not limited to a single moment in time. It becomes part of an ongoing process, one that extends beyond the individuals directly involved and into the broader systems that define how such events are understood and addressed. In the end, what remains is not just the memory of what occurred, but the awareness that it has altered something, subtly, perhaps, but meaningfully. An awareness that carries forward, shaping perception, informing action, and ensuring that even as time moves on, the significance of the story is not entirely lost. There is a quiet shift that happens after a story like this has been told enough times. The details remain the same, the sequence of events unchanged, but the way they are held in the mind begins to transform. What once felt immediate becomes something more reflective, something that invites not just reaction, but interpretation. The case of Luca Magnotta enters that phase gradually, moving from shock into analysis, from outrage into a more complex form of understanding that resists simple conclusions. This shift does not happen all at once, and it does not happen uniformly for everyone. But it marks an important transition, from witnessing to processing, from absorbing information to questioning what it means and how it fits into a broader context. In that space of reflection, attention often returns to the patterns that existed before the crime itself. The behaviors that, in hindsight, appear significant, but at the time were dispersed, fragmented, difficult to interpret with certainty. The online activity, the constructed identity, the gradual escalation in the nature of the content, these elements are examined again, not with the urgency of immediate response, but with the intention of understanding how they connect, how they might have been recognized differently, how they might inform future awareness. This kind of reflection is not about rewriting the past, but about identifying points where perception could shift, where recognition could become more precise, where signals might be understood in a way that allows for earlier intervention. It is a complex process because it requires balancing caution with action, ensuring that awareness does not become overreaction, while still acknowledging that certain patterns carry meaning that should not be ignored. The role of digital space in shaping these patterns becomes even more central in this phase of consideration. The internet is not a neutral backdrop in the story. It is an active environment that influences behavior, amplifies certain actions, and creates feedback loops that can reinforce specific tendencies. For someone like Luca Magnotta, the presence of an audience, even an imagined one, played a significant role in how actions were constructed and carried out. The distinction between private thought and public display becomes blurred, and in that blurred space, actions can take on a different character, one that is shaped not only by internal motivation but by the anticipation of external response. This raises ongoing questions about how digital platforms are structured, how content is monitored, how responsibility is distributed across individuals, communities, and institutions. These are not questions with simple or static answers, because the environment itself is constantly evolving. New forms of interaction emerge, new technologies reshape the way information is shared, and with each change, the balance between openness and control must be reconsidered. Within this broader reflection, it is essential to maintain a clear focus on Jun Lin as more than a point within a narrative. His life represents a continuity that existed independently of the events that brought his name into public awareness. The goals he pursued, the routines he followed, the connections he maintained, these elements define a reality that cannot be reduced to the circumstances of his death. Remembering that reality is not only an act of respect, but a necessary part of ensuring that the story retains its human dimension. Without that dimension, the analysis risks becoming detached, focused entirely on systems and behaviors while losing sight of the individual impact that gives those systems meaning. There is also a broader societal layer to this reflection, one that considers how communities respond to events that challenge their sense of safety and understanding. In Montreal, as in many other places, the immediate reaction to such a case includes shock, concern, re-evaluation of assumptions about what is possible within familiar environments. Over time, those reactions evolve, integrating into a more stable awareness that does not dominate daily life, but remains present as a point of reference. This integration is part of how societies adapt, how they incorporate difficult experiences into a framework that allows for continuity while still acknowledging change. It is not a process that eliminates risk or uncertainty, but it creates a context in which those elements can be approached with greater understanding. The psychological dimensions of the case continue to invite examination as well. The interplay between identity, perception, and behavior, the ways in which internal narratives can shape external actions, these are areas that extend beyond this single case, touching on broader questions about human behavior and the factors that influence it. Exploring these dimensions does not provide definitive answers, but it contributes to a more nuanced understanding, one that recognizes the complexity of the factors involved rather than reducing them to simple explanations. This nuance is important because it allows for a more accurate assessment of how similar situations might develop, how they might be recognized, how responses might be structured. As this phase of reflection deepens, The story becomes less about the sequence of events and more about the insights that can be drawn from them. Not in a way that extracts clear lessons or prescriptive conclusions, but in a way that expands the range of considerations, that encourages ongoing questioning, that resists the temptation to simplify. This does not make the story easier to hold, but it makes it more meaningful, more connected to the broader context in which it exists. And in that connection, there is a form of continuity, not of events, but of understanding, of awareness, of the ongoing effort to engage with complex realities in a way that is both thoughtful and grounded. As the story continues to settle into memory, what begins to surface are not just the events themselves, but the spaces between them. The moments where something could have been noticed, where a different decision might have altered the trajectory, where silence or uncertainty allowed the pattern to continue uninterrupted. These spaces are difficult to confront because they do not offer clear answers. They exist in ambiguity, in hindsight, in the uneasy recognition that understanding often comes too late. In the case surrounding Luca Magnotta, those spaces are particularly complex, shaped by the intersection of personal behavior, digital exposure, and institutional response. They are not defined by a single failure or a single oversight, but by a series of conditions that, when combined, created an environment where escalation could occur without immediate interruption. Reflecting on these conditions requires a careful balance. It is easy to look back and identify patterns, to connect points that were not clearly linked at the time. But doing so risks oversimplifying the reality of how information is processed in the moment, how decisions are made under uncertainty, how limited data can obscure the full scope of a situation. At the same time, avoiding that reflection entirely would mean missing an opportunity to understand how awareness can evolve, how systems can adapt, how responses can become more attuned to the kinds of signals that, while subtle, carry significance. This tension between hindsight clarity and real-time ambiguity is central to how the case is interpreted over time. The digital environment remains one of the most challenging aspects to fully grasp. It is not just a space where information exists, but a space where behavior is shaped, reinforced, and sometimes amplified in ways that are not immediately visible. For someone like Luca Magnotta, the presence of an audience, real or imagined, was not incidental. It was part of the structure of his actions, influencing not only what was done, but how it was presented, how it was shared, how it was meant to be received. This introduces a layer of complexity that extends beyond individual responsibility, touching on the broader dynamics of visibility, attention, and validation in digital spaces. The question is not simply how such content is created, but how it circulates, how it is encountered, how it becomes part of a wider network of observation that can, unintentionally, contribute to its impact. Addressing this complexity does not involve a single solution. It involves ongoing adjustment, a continuous process of evaluating how platforms function, how moderation is implemented, how users engage with what they see. It also involves recognizing that the boundaries between private and public behavior are increasingly fluid, that actions taken in one context can quickly move into another, gaining visibility in ways that were not originally anticipated. This fluidity makes it more difficult to contain harmful content, but it also makes it more important to develop approaches that are responsive, adaptable, and grounded in an understanding of how these environments operate. Within this broader reflection, the presence of Jun Lin remains a point of clarity. His story does not belong to the complexity of systems or the ambiguity of digital dynamics. It is grounded in a life that was real, structured, meaningful in its own right. Returning to that reality is essential because it anchors the entire narrative in something tangible, something that cannot be abstracted or generalized. It reminds us that behind every layer of analysis, every discussion about behavior or systems, there is a person whose absence is the most direct and undeniable consequence of what occurred. This grounding does not resolve the broader questions, but it ensures that they are approached with the appropriate sense of weight, that they are not detached from the human context that gives them significance. As time continues to move forward, the case becomes part of a larger body of knowledge, a reference point that informs how similar situations are understood and addressed. It contributes to training, to policy discussions, to the development of frameworks that aim to identify risk earlier, to respond more effectively, to bridge the gap between recognition and action. These developments are often gradual, incremental, not always visible to the public, but they represent a form of continuity, an extension of the impact of the case into areas that have the potential to influence future outcomes. This does not guarantee prevention, and it does not eliminate uncertainty, but it reflects an ongoing effort to engage with complexity rather than avoid it. There is also an individual dimension to how this story is carried forward. For those who encountered it closely, investigators, legal professionals, community members, the memory may remain vivid, shaped by direct experience. For others, it becomes part of a broader awareness, a story that informs perception without dominating it. These different levels of engagement are part of how collective memory functions, how stories are attained, adapted, and integrated into a wider context. And within that context, the significance of the case does not depend on constant attention, but on its ability to influence understanding in subtle, enduring ways. It becomes part of the way certain patterns are recognized, certain risks are considered, certain questions are asked. Not always consciously, not always directly, but present nonetheless. In this sense, the story does not end in a definitive way. It transitions into a different form, one that is less about what happened and more about how what happened continues to shape thought, perception, and response. It remains as a point of reference, a moment that, while fixed in time, continues to interact with the present in ways that are both visible and unseen. And within that interaction, there is an ongoing process, not of resolution but of engagement, of the continuous effort to understand, to adapt, and to respond to the complexities that stories like this reveal. There comes a point in stories like this where the facts no longer change, but the meaning continues to shift. The sequence is fixed, the timeline established, the responsibilities defined, yet the interpretation remains in motion, influenced by distance, by context, by the quiet accumulation of reflection over time. The case tied to Luca Magnotta reaches that stage not as a conclusion but as a transformation. It moves away from the immediacy of events and into something more enduring, something that exists in the way people think about visibility, identity, and the fragile boundary between performance and reality. Because at its core, this was not only an act of violence, but an act constructed to be seen, to be consumed, to be remembered in a very specific way. And that intention complicates everything that follows. It forces a reconsideration of what it means to witness something in a world where witnessing can happen instantly, globally, and without consent. It raises the uncomfortable possibility that attention itself can become part of the mechanism through which harm is extended. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but through the simple act of looking, of sharing, of reacting. And in that dynamic, the role of the audience becomes more complex than it first appears. It is no longer a passive position. It is part of a system that interacts with the event, that shapes its reach, that influences how it is perceived and remembered. This does not assign blame to those who encounter such content, but it does introduce a layer of responsibility that is difficult to define and even more difficult to navigate. How does one remain informed without contributing to amplification? How does one engage with reality without becoming part of a cycle that extends its impact? These are not questions with clear boundaries, and they reflect the evolving nature of how information moves through the world. In Montreal, the physical traces of the case have long since been absorbed into the normal rhythm of the city. There are no visible markers that indicate what occurred, no signs that distinguish one building from another. And yet, the absence of visible evidence does not mean the absence of memory. It exists in less tangible forms, in the awareness carried by those who remember, in the subtle shifts in how certain patterns are recognized, in the way conversations about safety and awareness are shaped by what has been learned. This form of memory is not static. It changes as new experiences are added, as perspectives evolve, as the distance from the original event increases. But it does not disappear. It becomes part of a broader understanding, one that influences perception in ways that are not always immediately apparent. The digital dimension, however, resists this kind of quiet integration. It remains active, persistent, capable of resurfacing without warning. Fragments of the case continue to exist in various forms, referenced, discussed, sometimes distorted as they move through different contexts. This persistence creates a different kind of challenge, one that involves not only managing content, but understanding how it interacts with those who encounter it. Because exposure is not neutral. It leaves an impression, sometimes brief, sometimes lasting, depending on the individual and the context. And when that exposure involves material that was never meant to be simply informational, but deliberately constructed to provoke, to disturb, to capture attention, the impact becomes even more complex. Addressing this requires more than technical solutions. It requires an ongoing conversation about how information is shared, how it is framed, how it is contextualized in a way that reduces harm while preserving the ability to understand what has occurred. Within all of this, returning to Jun Lin remains essential. Not as a closing note, but as a constant point of reference. His life is not defined by the way it ended, but by everything that came before, by the intentions, the efforts, the relationships that shaped his presence in the world. Holding on to that perspective is not only a matter of respect, but a way of maintaining clarity in how the story is understood. It prevents the narrative from being consumed entirely by the mechanics of the crime, by the analysis of behavior, by the broader discussions about systems and media. It ensures that the human element remains central, that the story does not drift into abstraction. There is also a deeper layer of reflection that emerges when considering the motivations behind actions like these. The desire to be seen, to be recognized, to have an impact, these are not inherently destructive impulses. They are part of human experience. But when they become disconnected from empathy, from the recognition of others as individuals with their own realities, they can take on a different form, one that prioritizes visibility over consequence. Understanding that shift is complex, because it involves not only individual psychology, but the environments that shape how recognition is achieved, how attention is rewarded, how identity is constructed and perceived. This does not provide a simple explanation, but it opens a space for deeper consideration, for exploring how these factors interact, how they might be addressed in ways that reduce the risk of similar outcomes. As the story continues to exist in this reflective space, it becomes less about recounting what happened and more about engaging with what it reveals. Not in a way that seeks closure, but in a way that acknowledges the ongoing nature of understanding. Because stories like this do not resolve neatly. They leave behind questions that remain active, that continue to influence thought and discussion long after the events themselves have passed. And perhaps that is where their significance ultimately lies, not only in the details that define them, but in the way they continue to shape the way people see, think, and respond to the world around them. There is a lingering quiet that follows a story once it has been told from every angle, analyzed through every lens, and absorbed into the broader awareness of those who encountered it. It is not silence in the literal sense, but a kind of stillness, a space where the urgency is faded, where the intensity is softened, yet the weight remains. The case connected to Luca Magnotta settles into that space, no longer unfolding, no longer changing, but continuing to exist in a form that invites contemplation rather than reaction. In that stillness, the details do not disappear. They remain intact, but they are no longer the center of attention. Instead, what begins to take shape is a broader understanding of what those details represent, how they connect to larger patterns, how they reveal something about the environments in which they occurred. This shift does not make the story easier to hold, but it changes the way it is held, moving it from the surface of awareness into something deeper, more integrated. In Montreal, the passage of time has done what it always does. It has layered new experiences over old ones, gradually reshaping the way the past is perceived. Buildings have been repurposed, streets have seen countless new faces, routines have continued, without interruption. To an outside observer, there is nothing to distinguish the present from any other moment. But memory does not operate on the same visible plane. It exists beneath the surface, carried by those who remember, influencing perception in ways that are often subtle but persistent. This kind of memory does not demand attention. It does not interrupt daily life. But it remains accessible, ready to surface, when something recalls it, when a conversation touches on familiar themes, when a pattern echoes something that was once seen before. The digital dimension, however, resists this gradual softening. It holds onto fragments with a kind of permanence that physical spaces do not share. References to the case continue to appear, sometimes in expected places, articles, discussions, documentaries, and sometimes in unexpected ones, where context is thinner, where details are separated from their original framework. This creates a challenge that extends beyond preservation into interpretation. Because when fragments are encountered without context, they can be misunderstood, distorted, or stripped of the nuance that gives them meaning. And in a case like this, where the actions themselves were intertwined with the intention to be seen, to be circulated, the risk of that distortion becomes even more significant. It requires a conscious effort to maintain context, to ensure that what is remembered is not only accurate, but understood within the framework that reflects its complexity. Within that effort, the presence of Jun Lin remains a central anchor. His life is not a fragment. It is a complete narrative that existed before it intersected with the events that brought it into public view. Holding on to that completeness is essential because it resists the tendency to reduce individuals to the roles they occupy within a single story. It restores balance, ensuring that the narrative does not become defined solely by the actions of the person who caused harm. This balance is not automatic. It requires intention, a deliberate choice to focus not only on what happened, but on who was affected, on what was lost, on the reality that extends beyond the moment of the crime itself. As reflection deepens, the case also becomes a point of reference for understanding broader dynamics, how attention functions, how identity can be constructed and performed, how the desire to be seen can intersect with environments that amplify that visibility in unpredictable ways. These dynamics are not confined to this story. They exist across different contexts, influencing behavior in ways that are not always immediately apparent. Recognizing them does not provide simple solutions, but it creates awareness, a foundation upon which more thoughtful responses can be built. It encourages a more critical engagement with the systems that shape visibility, with the ways in which content is created, shared, and consumed. It invites questions about responsibility, not only at the level of individuals, but at the level of platforms, communities, and institutions that participate in the flow of information. These questions do not have fixed answers, and they evolve as the environment changes. But their presence is significant because it reflects an ongoing effort to understand rather than ignore the complexities that cases like this reveal. There is also a personal dimension to this phase of reflection, one that varies from person to person. Some may find that the story remains vivid, that certain images or ideas continue to surface unexpectedly. Others may find that it fades into the background, becoming one of many narratives that contribute to a general awareness without occupying a central place in memory. Both responses are valid, both are part of how people process and integrate difficult information. What matters is not the intensity of the memory, but the presence of understanding, the ability to recognize patterns, to engage with complexity, to respond with a level of awareness that has been shaped, in part, by what has been learned. In this way, the story does not end. It transitions into a different form of existence, one that is less visible but still active, influencing thought and perception in ways that are not always immediately recognized. It becomes part of a larger continuum, a network of experiences and reflections that inform how the world is understood. And within that continuum, its significance is not measured by how often it is recalled, but by how it has contributed to a deeper, more nuanced way of seeing, of questioning, of engaging with the realities that exist beneath the surface of everyday life. In the end, what remains is not the noise that once surrounded the case, not the headlines or the rapid spread of information, but something quieter and more enduring, a recognition that certain stories do not truly conclude, they settle into the fabric of understanding, shaping perception in ways that are often invisible but deeply present. The narrative surrounding Luca Magnotta reaches that final stage not with a sense of closure, but with a kind of still awareness, an understanding that the events have ended, but their implications continue to move outward, influencing thought, conversation, and the way reality itself is interpreted. In Montreal, life has long since resumed its ordinary rhythm, layered over what once disrupted it. The city does not carry visible scars, and yet, for those who know, there is an added dimension to certain places, a quiet acknowledgement that something once unfolded there that altered the way those spaces are perceived. It is not something that dominates. but it exists, subtle and persistent, a reminder that even the most familiar environments can hold complexities that are not immediately apparent. This awareness does not create fear, but it introduces a form of attentiveness, a recognition that reality is not always as simple as it appears on the surface. The digital world, however, does not allow for the same kind of quiet settling. It retains fragments, echoes, references that can reappear without warning, detached from their original context or reframed through new perspectives. This persistence means that the story continues to exist in motion, circulating in ways that are not always controlled or predictable. It becomes part of a broader conversation about visibility, about the power of images and narratives, about the responsibilities that come with both creating and consuming content. These conversations are ongoing, evolving as technology changes, as new platforms emerge, as the boundaries between private and public continue to blur. And within those conversations, the case serves as a reference point, not because it is unique in every aspect, but because it illustrates certain dynamics with a clarity that is difficult to ignore. At the center of all of this, it is essential to return, once more, to Jun Lin, not as a final note, not as an afterthought, but as the core of the entire narrative. His life is not defined by the way it ended, but by everything that came before, the choices he made, the path he was building, the quiet, ordinary moments that formed the substance of his existence. Remembering that is not only an act of respect, but a way of restoring balance, of ensuring that the story does not become dominated entirely by the actions that disrupted it. It is a way of holding on to what was real, what was meaningful, what continues to matter beyond the framework of the case itself. There is also a broader understanding that emerges when considering the motivations and conditions that shaped the events. The desire for recognition, the construction of identity, the influence of environments that amplify visibility, these are elements that extend beyond a single individual, reflecting patterns that can be observed in different forms across different contexts. Understanding these patterns does not excuse what happened, nor does it reduce its severity, but it provides a lens through which the complexity of human behavior can be examined more fully. It allows for a deeper engagement with the factors that contribute to such outcomes, encouraging a more thoughtful approach to how those factors might be addressed in the future. This does not lead to simple solutions, but it creates a foundation for awareness, for dialogue, for the gradual development of responses that are informed by experience rather than assumption. As the story reaches this final phase, it becomes less about recounting events and more about carrying forward what has been understood. Not in a way that demands constant attention, but in a way that integrates into the background of perception, influencing how certain signals are recognized, how certain risks are considered, how certain questions are asked. It becomes part of a collective memory, one that is shared not through repetition, but through the subtle ways in which it shapes thought and response. This form of memory does not fade entirely, even as time passes. It remains accessible, ready to surface when something calls it forward, when a pattern echoes something that has been seen before, when a conversation touches on themes that connect back to it. And in that sense, the story continues, not as an unfolding sequence of events, but as an ongoing presence within the way the world is understood. There is no definitive ending to that kind of presence. It does not conclude with a final statement or a clear resolution. Instead, it settles into a space where it can be revisited, reconsidered, reinterpreted as new perspectives emerge and new contexts develop. And perhaps that is the most honest way to understand it, not as a story that has been completed, but as one that has reached a point where it no longer needs to unfold, where its significance lies not in what happens next, but in how it continues to shape the way people see, think, and engage with the complexities of the world around them.